If you've been following this channel for a bit, you know by now that I have a weakness for art and design books, both on their own merits and how they can be a great inspiration for creating science fiction and fantasy, even, and maybe especially, when they aren't actually about anything in those categories. But today I'm talking about an art book that is in that category. It is The Art and Making of Arcane League of Legends, a massive and beautifully assembled visual guide to the hit TV series. I love the show. I was absolutely blindsided, not just by the visuals, but by the storytelling and the themes, and so I socked away pennies to pick up a copy of the book when I could. Now, what I like most about the book is not just the way it showcases the world they built, the characters they designed, although there is plenty of that. You can lose an afternoon or three just wandering through the design work. And the book's big format presentation, which includes things like multi-page foldouts, really complements it all. And there's also a lot of in-depth text and discussion with the team behind the show, and what they say echoes many specific points that I've made before on this channel about creativity, and especially about how that applies to making science fiction and fantasy. So I want to chomp out a few of these excerpts and I want to talk about them. Now, one common thing I talk about a great deal here is how you always want to be looking outside the immediate circle of what you're working on for inspiration. And the most basic way this comes up is, if you're doing something with a science fiction or fantasy flavor, look outside science fiction and fantasy and look in broadly and deeply as you can for as many things as you can. And the Arcane team did exactly that. Much was informed by an approach that seems counterintuitive at first glance. Arcane is not conceived like an animated series, Pascal Charoux said. Most of our references are live-action series or movies. Looking at the Fortiche founders' workspaces at the company's headquarters in Paris, one can see posters for classic Hollywood movies. Shelves are packed with as many books about filmmakers as there are about art or design. Some of the mise-en-scène decisions were influenced by specific live-action directors, chief among them Brian De Palma, who is revered in France a lot more than he is in his native United States, and is a big deal among Fortiche employees. Almost all the people interviewed for this book brought him up. De Palma is cited, for example, as one of the prime influences on the suspenseful scene in episode 201, where Vi realizes that enemies have infiltrated the memorial ceremony for the council members killed in Jinx's attack. I was thinking of a scene in The Untouchables, which itself nods to Battleship Potemkin. They exchange glances, the tension ratchets up. Now, I've seen the scene in question, and it does nod in that direction, but it's not a lift. It's not a one-for-one, shot-for-shot kind of reference. It's more about the flavor of the whole thing. It's especially fascinating to hear what general concepts, rather than specific references, fed the imagination of the show's creators, often in indirect ways. Anne Loreto, Fortiche art supervisor, explains that the process begins with immersion, to soak up as many sources and options as possible. We consume a lot of images in every medium you can think of, she said. At the very beginning, it's all over the place. We can look at fashion and jewelry just to have an idea of shapes, things that could be useful, even if they appear to be very different. This reminds me, by the way, of something director Denis Villeneuve said to his design team when they started work on his adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. And he said that they not look to images that were recent whenever possible. He wanted them to go back 100 years or more to look at things from natural history books or from art that wasn't recent or not commercial. And likewise, the Arcane team didn't do a lot of looking at other video game adaptations or other video games or other animated projects. They looked at, as you saw, live-action filmmaking or things in the real world. And I distinctly remember Hayao Miyazaki, the founder of Studio Ghibli, saying much the same things, that referencing the real world is more valuable and powerful than referencing other animation. And there's another great point that they make about their world-building process, which stems from limitations. I always had the feeling that what would be player-facing and what we had in our heads about these characters was the tip of the iceberg. In my mind, there were a lot of hooks to grab onto. Knowing that there were so much behind the scenes that we hadn't released to the player, it was also a big part of the motivation to try and get something like the show made. It was like, man, there's so much world here that we wish we could show you in greater fidelity. Coincidentally, Paul Bellezza, director of creative game production at League of Legends, reached for the same simile when talking about the huge amount of work leading to relatively little that's visible to players. In the early days, we just kept it open enough to go, there's probably an iceberg here, we don't know how big or how shallow it is, so let's leave it open so that anything can happen, Bellezza said. It was just the constraints of the time, and then the team started to refine that process to really think through art design and animatics. We all knew that the art, the story, and the game design needed to synergize, but we would lean more on one or the other. Nowadays, they build new characters with a huge iceberg or with tentacles to other icebergs. They would build that with a lot of depth so they can write other things. But back then it was the Wild West. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to take this point by point. And the first point is that what you end up showing the reader or the viewer is always going to be a tiny subset of what you've come up with or could come up with. In the same way, when you're telling your story as a whole, you're choosing what part of the story to put in front of people. And that's how storytelling works. Storytelling is selectivity and editing. And the other point is how this is wrapped up with the way projects have finitude. You have only so much time to work on something and to complete it. One of the best lines I ever heard about this goes like this: "Things are due, they're never done." And even if you are creating for yourself first with no hard deadlines, as I am, you still have to be conscious of how there's only 24 hours in a day and only one of you and only one lifetime to get things done in. But here's the thing, that forces you to make decisions about what's in the frame, what's out of the frame. And if you make those decisions well, they're not going to chop your work off at the knees. Quite the opposite. They're going to make it focused and specific. This story is about this person in this part of this world at this time and place. And when you're doing something fantastic, where a lot of that is going to be totally new, you actually need more selectivity. The better to keep your audience from being drowned in details that they can't process. And one more thing from this passage also caught my eye, the bit about the iceberg. And that's something that strikes me as being really valuable in the early stages of a work, when you might not know much about the world you're going to explore yet. And at that stage, it's okay to leave things open-ended, and then to fill them in later as you wander around in the story during your first drafts. That's why we write and revise. It's not just to fix things up, but to find out what the story is really about, and what the world it takes place in really is. If you have rigid and predefined conceits about all that from the beginning, they may prove to be brittle when they come up against realities in the story that are at odds with what you had in mind. Another thing that caught my attention was the way the team dealt with issues of story texture. Arcane isn't just about one flavor. There's a whole buffet table of them. There's family drama, there's political intrigue, there's criminal machinations, aspirations of genius, the list goes on. And so that meant they were constantly looking for ways to deliver all that in just as varied a fashion. Here's an example of that by the way of them talking about how they staged a fight. The fight scenes in Arcane are among the most beautifully kinetically directed and choreographed of any recent screen project. What makes them even more remarkable is that each of these scenes is distinctive from each other. A perfect example is Echo and Jinx's fight in episode 107. Editor Nazim Aslem was very aware of the need to avoid repetitiveness in the action scenes, and he found unlikely inspiration in the Raymond Queneau book Exercises in Style. The book was published in France in 1947, and within its pages, the author tells the same anecdote in 99 different ways. We could stage a fight like a musical, another with puppets, a funny one. We could do them in completely different registers, Meslem thought to himself. So when we started brainstorming the big fight in 107, I said, isn't this an opportunity to do it as a music video? There already was a slightly similar scene at the beginning of the episode, but Arnaud Delorde gave the green light. The trick was to have a different approach. The first video in the episode was all mood, no plot, and we couldn't do that again, Meslem said. So we thought we'd go back to Jinx and Echo's childhood and their relationship. One thing just leads to another. And here's another example of this. What makes Arcane so idiosyncratically creative, or is that creatively idiosyncratic, is the trust-based partnership between Riot and Fortiche, which allowed them to be open to each other's suggestions and change direction when something wasn't working. An example members of both teams spontaneously mentioned was the slightly ghoulish dinner party in episode 109, when Jinx has captured Silco, Vi, and Caitlyn, and the tension between the sisters reaches an apex. Christian Link and Alex Ye were struggling to trying to write the scene, and they were getting frustrated. Julianne Georgel recalls that there were several versions of the scene in the planning stage, all rather different from what ended up in the show. One of them involved a big fight, and then there was one more in the middle round with Jinx, who facetiously was spinning her propeller blades, Georgel said. It was getting to be expensive and also more cartoonish than emotional. So Arnaud Delorde came up with the idea of a family dinner. It was more intimate, more human, and it felt emotionally rewarding than just another brawl. Link remembers that the creative dynamic was turned on its head. Usually my experience is that Fortiche works well with us when they can react to something and they can make the best version of what it can be, he said. But this was really us being like, man, this is a very loaded, difficult scene. And so we just said, give us the scene that you can imagine and we will try to write that. I remember a reference for this dinner table scene that was from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is so totally different, Yi added. It's a really good example of how you can hear a pitch and struggle with seeing the vision that's in someone's head. Without trust, without sort of established relationship, I don't know how you could just be, okay, let's go. This also works as another example of out-of-the-box inspirations. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is most often referenced for, well, other things. So seeing them draw on it for this one very specific and surprising piece of textual variety is a great example. There's no other scene in the entire series that exactly resembles that one in its staging or flavor. And that kind of textual variety in a story really helps, especially a story with a fantastic setting, where we're there because we don't just want people in a room talking at each other. Now, you are going to have some scenes that are just people sitting in a room talking, but any way you can add some flavor layers to that are going to help. And the more you scout around for such flavors and layers, the more you'll have on hand to think about. One last point I want to make about me recommending this book. My recommendations for it, as with all the other good stuff I talk about here, go above and beyond recommending it if you're trying to create something with the same flavor as Arcane. If anything, it's the other way around. It's useful to look at this book if you're making something with the same flavor, but not so that you could copy from it. It's so that you have some idea of where else you can look and why, to look where they were looking. And likewise, if you're doing something with a fantastic flavor to it, but not at all of the same kind as Arcane, then you can approach this book in the same spirit to see how they went from their ideas and their difficulties to the finished product, and how that process matters no matter what the materials or the goals are. What were the challenges they faced in trying to put some particular on the screen coherently? How did their backgrounds as creators help inform them to overcome those challenges? Things like that. Every really good book I've ever read about any art form, whether it was an animated TV show or a classic jazz album, it always focused on the process, the raw materials, the sources, the backgrounds, the steps taken, the dead ends backed out of, the lessons learned. And that's important because so many acts of creating, especially for fantastic works, they feel like black boxes. All we know how to do at first is copy the outside. Then every now and then you get something like this, which takes those details and lifts the lid on them. And that's so useful. So once again, the book is The Art and Making of Arcane, League of Legends. There is a digital edition available, but I would only recommend that if you don't have the shelf space for the printed copy. But let's face it, you want to make room on the shelf for something both this gorgeous and thoughtful. See what you think.